has grief come up for you around your sobriety journey, around quitting alcohol, around making any big lifestyle change? Have you felt any grief come up as you've shifted your life or considered shifting your life? Grief has been the most surprising part of my alcohol-free journey, so I want to touch on it today and acknowledge it in case anyone else needs to hear this. So I quit alcohol 11 months ago, and I really thought that quitting alcohol consisted of, in the most basic way, simply avoiding having a drink. I thought it was that basic. I didn't think it was easy, and I knew that because I have tried to quit alcohol so many times in my life, and I always went back after a month or 2 months, or like a day on some occasions, you know. But I didn't realize that there were so many more layers to this decision to quit alcohol. And it was only when I finally got serious about quitting that so much revealed itself and came up for me. And it has mostly looked like grief, or at least that's been a big aspect of it. So I actually looked up what grief means because while in some sense I know what it means, it can be helpful to read it in words. So it's sorrow over a loss. That is grief. Sorrow over a loss. And or a great sense of sorrow over a loss. And so often we think of grief in relation to losing someone. So maybe losing someone to death, or maybe like a divorce or a breakup. But mostly we kind of keep it to those areas of life. We don't necessarily think of grief as something we might experience over sobriety and who, like, losing who we used to be and losing time to alcohol or drugs or whatever it may be. We can also experience grief over traumatic events that don't necessarily include death per se, but the death of who we used to be, because traumatic events can cause us to change in an instant, and we might have to grieve that loss. Another example that I've seen and heard of is the collective grief that we have experienced with everything that happened in 2020. Our world changed completely, and we all endured so much. Different stories, but all together, everything changed. And there's some grief that has come up for it, but are we all grieving? Are we actively grieving? I don't know. Maybe everyone's on their own path with that. But all that to say that we can experience grief and have to grieve this loss of us and society and the way things were, even if there's not a death per se, but there is a death of who we were, how things were. And that's what I've experienced with giving up alcohol, is grief for all of the time that I spent drinking. And I guess there's also a grief of over the person I was. So what I've learned is that there's stages to grief. There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And a person doesn't necessarily jump from step to step and make their way through the steps of the stages of grief in order on a timeline. It's unique to the individual. It's unique to each person, and we can kind of weave through them, come back to them. It's not a linear journey, but it's part of it. And from what I've experienced, grief has been part of what has sat between me and going back to a drink. So I think in the past, when I would try to quit alcohol, I wasn't able to sit with any of my emotions. So I would just go back to drinking. I wasn't even aware of this, honestly. It's just I was experiencing discomfort of whatever, life, loneliness, just my own thoughts. So I'd run back to drinking. And I can see why I would do that because I didn't know how to sit with them. I didn't know how to process my emotions. And now I'm learning in my 30s. They say it's never too late. And I'm starting to believe that. It's never too late to learn how to process your emotions, sit with your emotions, accept your life, because you can't go back. You can't change the past. So that can be hard, especially if you've abused or if you've abused alcohol, if you've been addicted to alcohol or any other substance, or just made choices that you're not happy with. We have to learn to accept it, or they can just haunt us and ruin the days we have left if we let them. So learning to allow the grieving process over these changes, over these shifts I've made, has been really helpful. Now, I'm not a grief expert. I'm not claiming to be. I learn a little bit at a time. But I found a grief group for sober people. So we sit with each other and support each other through the grief. And actually, have you heard of Dr. John Deloney? Deloney. I think that's his name. He's a mental health expert. He has a YouTube channel. I guess I'll link him below. This will be my first link. He takes live calls and offers mental health support and guidance for people struggling with a multitude of issues. And he quoted David Kessler, who is a grief expert. And I'm only going the roundabout way of explaining how, because I'm not familiar with David Kessler, aside from the fact that I know he's written a book about grief. But his quote is that grief demands to be witnessed. Grief wants to be heard. Grief wants to be supported. Grief wants company. And I'm finding that to be true. It helps me to have support. It helps me to be in a grief group. And, I live in the United States, and it's so easy to avoid the time and space necessary to grieve. And I would say this is probably even true when we lose someone. When we lose someone to death, maybe when we lose someone to a divorce, it's easy to shove the feelings down, push them aside, ignore them for as long as possible, and just move on. Our pace of life kind of asks us to do that as well, to just keep pushing through. But this is our life. It's one of a kind. It's sacred. It's special. It deserves our attention, our care. That's part of the journey. And not to mention properly caring for all the feelings and the emotions that come up in our bodies and our lives can only help us moving forward. So even with death and divorce and really big losses that are so obvious, we don't necessarily give ourselves time to properly grieve. So it's to be expected that this would also apply to something like getting sober, quitting alcohol, and any other loss that isn't, so easily understood. Because I would say that maybe people who haven't gone through this sober journey don't necessarily understand all the feelings that come up with it. And it can be intense. It can. It's more intense than I thought it would be. But there's so much to learn. It is a special journey. And it has been a surprising part of the journey. And this is really what I wanted to acknowledge today. I know it's been kind of rambling, but this is what I wanted to acknowledge today, is that it comes up. It's okay to feel all the things that come up over the time spent drinking, over the identity shift, over the loss, over the mistakes, over the errors, over the pain, over the hurt caused yourself and others. It's part of it. And it's not necessarily easy. I won't tell you what it's supposed to be for you because it's your own unique path to walk. But yeah, it's part of it. It's part of it. And that's what's been on my mind recently. The surprising grief that comes up with getting sober, quitting alcohol. And that's life, baby. What a ride.